I never imagined I'd find myself in this position, glaring across the room at my husband's ex, who was invited to my own wedding by my soon-to-be mother-in-law. The look on this woman's face was as smug as it was triumphant, and I had no clue how to hide my mortification. We had done the usual wedding prep, picking out centerpieces, coordinating colors, tasting a decadent cake, but nothing prepared me for the moment I'd see Amanda waltzing through the church doors, escorted in by my mother-in-law, Janet. Her presence felt like a cruel joke, especially considering her track record with my husband, Eric. She had cheated on him several times, leaving him shattered in the aftermath of a betrayal that nearly broke his spirit. While he had long since moved on, I still couldn't believe Janet would think Amanda had any place at our celebration. Yet Janet saw no problem with it, insisting that Amanda could teach me how to be a good wife. As I stood there in my lace gown, flowers quivering in my grasp, I wondered if I was caught in some bizarre dream. My cheeks burned, a flush of humiliation creeping up my neck. How on earth had it come to this? Eric had mentioned Amanda before, describing her as the woman who once filled him with hope for a joyful future. She was vibrant and charming, the kind of person who could captivate any room, but that outer glow concealed a toxic tendency to lie and stray. In the end, her infidelity was so blatant that even her friends couldn't deny it. Eric had walked away, shattered and ashamed, believing for the longest time that he'd failed as a partner. When we first started dating, he'd been honest about his heartbreak, wanting to ensure we built our relationship on trust and openness. I respected that. I appreciated his vulnerability and admired his ability to persevere. Still, it seemed his mother had never really accepted his decision to end things with Amanda, nor did she think I was up to par in the wife department. From the moment we got engaged, Janet took it upon herself to offer guidance on everything from how I should manage the household to how I should dress. This culminating fiasco, where she paraded Amanda at our wedding, felt like the final straw. It was a brazen insult to me as a bride and a testament to the lengths she'd go to maintain her illusions. As I tried to compose myself, my sister Tessa ushered me into the bridal suite, seething with indignation. She demanded to know how Amanda ended up here, while my best friend Jill stood by, looking ready to escort the intruder out with her own two hands. I was torn between letting them handle the situation and dealing with it head-on. After all, my wedding day was supposed to be a celebration, not a battleground for petty drama. Then Eric appeared, his eyes darting anxiously between Tessa, Jill, and me. He looked as stricken as I felt. "I'll take care of this," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He headed off in search of his mother, leaving me to wrestle with 1,000 conflicting emotions. Part of me just wanted to get through the ceremony, say my vows, and focus on our future. Another part felt so thoroughly disrespected that I wanted to scream or run away. Ultimately, I had to remember why we were there: our love, our commitment, our desire to share this moment with those closest to us. Though clearly, closest was a subjective term when it came to Janet's unusual guest list. Nothing about this felt normal. Despite the chaos, the ceremony eventually proceeded. I held my bouquet in trembling hands, walking down the aisle while the organ played softly. I could see Eric's face brightening when he caught sight of me, and that alone gave me the strength to keep going. Amanda, conspicuous in the third row, watched with a curious mixture of longing and triumph. Janet, seated beside her, kept darting glances my way as if to gauge whether I'd absorbed some lesson through Amanda's presence. I felt my entire body tense with fury. Still, Eric's calm gaze reassured me. We exchanged our vows, promising to cherish and support one another for the rest of our lives. For a moment, the world receded, leaving only the two of us bound by love. Then, we sealed it with a kiss and walked back up the aisle as husband and wife, the applause greeting us like a fragile shield against the negativity brewing in the background. No matter how messy the day had turned, we had still done it. We were married. Yet, as we made our way to the reception, a haunting sense of dread followed me. I knew the drama with Amanda and Janet was far from over. Sure enough, the reception was a minefield of awkward encounters. Our guests were divided, those blissfully unaware of the drama and those murmuring about the audacity of Amanda's appearance. My mother, who had never been fond of Janet's controlling ways, kept sending me sympathetic smiles from across the room. Every so often, I spotted Amanda whispering to Janet, the two of them casting furtive glances in my direction. It was maddening, but I tried to keep a dignified veneer. I busied myself greeting friends and relatives, dancing with Eric, and stealing moments of laughter with Tessa. Somewhere in the back of my mind, though, I knew a confrontation was inevitable. Then, in a particularly brazen move, Janet cornered me by the buffet table. She told me I should be bringing Eric a plate of food instead of letting him fix his own. "Amanda always took such good care of him," she crooned, her tone condescending. My cheeks flared, but I swallowed my anger, not wanting to cause a scene in front of our guests. Later, Eric found me trembling in the hallway and asked what was wrong. When I told him what his mother said, a fierce protectiveness lit his eyes. "Enough," he muttered. "She's gone too far." The next thing I knew, Eric confronted Janet in an alcove near the coat check. I didn't catch every word, but the gist was clear. He was telling her that her interference was unwelcome, that she needed to stop undermining me, and that our marriage was our own. She looked incredulous, unable to fathom why her guidance was causing such turmoil. In a final blow, Eric demanded that if she couldn't respect his wife, then she shouldn't expect much of a relationship with him going forward. I stood a few steps away, heart pounding as I eavesdropped on this heated exchange. Janet's eyes glistened, but she held her ground, insisting she was only trying to ensure Eric's happiness by teaching me the ropes. Eventually, Amanda slinked over, placing a hand on Janet's shoulder as if to calm her. I realized in that moment how twisted the whole situation was. My new mother-in-law believed Amanda, who had cheated on Eric, was somehow a better role model than I was. It made no sense, and it filled me with a cold fury. Yet, I also felt a peculiar pang of pity for Janet, who seemed trapped in an archaic notion of what a wife should be. Over the next few months, Eric and I settled into married life, choosing to ignore Janet's unsolicited advice. We established our routines, shared chores, and nurtured a partnership that felt balanced and loving. The memory of Amanda's smug face at our wedding became a bizarre anecdote we used to remind each other how much we'd overcome. Meanwhile, Janet seemed to simmer with resentment whenever we saw her, often passive-aggressively alluding to the ways I was failing at being a dutiful wife. Nonetheless, our relationship with her trudged along in a strained equilibrium, largely for Eric's sake, though I had little desire to deepen our connection. Then, quite unexpectedly, everything changed when Janet's own marriage to Leonard, my father-in-law, came crashing down. One evening, I was folding laundry when Janet called in a frantic, tear-choked voice, begging to come over. When she arrived, she looked smaller somehow, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen from crying. Before I could even offer her tea, she broke down, confessing that Leonard had moved out and was talking about divorce. I was stunned. They had been married for 30 years, a milestone I'd assumed indicated resilience and harmony. But apparently, that facade hid deep cracks. Janet sobbed, asking me how she could fix things, pleading for my help in mending her fractured marriage. I felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. This was the same woman who had tried to sabotage my wedding, who had treated me like an unworthy apprentice to a cheating ex. Yet, she was also my husband's mother, and she was clearly in pain. In a moment of compassion, I offered her a listening ear. She admitted that Leonard claimed he had felt stifled for years. He was tired of being told how to live, what to eat, even who his friends should be. He accused her of constantly nagging and never allowing him autonomy, confessing he'd thought of leaving before. This time, he'd actually done it. Her voice trembled as she asked if I could speak to him, perhaps remind him of the good times, or convince him that she was willing to change. I hesitated, uncertain whether I should involve myself in their marital strife. However, a memory of my own father's departure years ago nudged me toward empathy. Sometimes people need an outsider to mediate. Still, I couldn't ignore the irony. The woman who insisted I needed lessons on marriage was now seeking my guidance to salvage hers. That night, I spoke with Eric about his mother's request. He was conflicted. He loved both parents, and the idea of them splitting after 3 decades unsettled him. Yet, he also recalled how Janet's overbearing tendencies had plagued him throughout his childhood. From dictating his hobbies to micromanaging his friendships, she had always been difficult to please. He dreaded the thought that Leonard had endured a similar pattern for years. Ultimately, though, Eric valued family enough to encourage me to at least hear Leonard out. So I arranged to meet my father-in-law for coffee. We chose a cozy cafe downtown, a neutral ground where neither of us would feel cornered. I arrived early, sipping a latte while anxiety knotted my stomach. When Leonard walked in, he looked drawn, like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. He offered a wan smile, took a seat, and thanked me for meeting him. Then, he opened up about the deep loneliness he'd felt in his marriage. Despite living under the same roof, he and Janet hadn't truly talked in years. She would simply issue instructions or criticisms, leaving no space for genuine dialogue. When he tried to express frustration, she dismissed him. Finally, he'd reached a breaking point. I listened, struggling to reconcile this quiet man's despair with the image of the picture-perfect marriage Janet had always presented to the world. Leonard admitted that he wasn't blameless. He had avoided confrontation for too long, preferring silence to arguments. But his passivity had limits, and Janet's controlling behavior chipped away at his emotional well-being. Now, he felt it was too late. He'd moved into a small apartment, begun seeking therapy on his own, and was considering the practicality of a divorce. My heart sank. I couldn't help remembering how Janet had manipulated situations at our wedding, all under the guise of guidance. If she had done that to me, a grown woman she barely knew, then Leonard's claims about feeling stifled were all too believable. In a gentle voice, I asked if there was any scenario in which he might give Janet another chance, provided she recognized her behavior and sincerely worked to change. He paused, swirling the coffee in his cup. "I don't know," he finally said. "I still love her, but I can't go back to the way things were. I won't survive it." His words resonated with a quiet finality, leaving me uncertain whether reconciliation was even possible. Later, I shared Leonard's perspective with Janet. She sat at my kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her teacup. I refrained from sugarcoating anything, explaining that Leonard felt suffocated and unheard. She seemed genuinely surprised, almost offended that he viewed her attentiveness as intrusive. Then, with a trembling lip, she insisted that she did everything for him. Cooked, cleaned, managed bills. Wasn't that what a good wife should do? Her voice echoed her old doctrine, that a wife's role was to pamper her husband. Struck by the irony, I reminded her of how she had tried to teach me to do the same through Amanda's presence at my wedding. Janet looked momentarily ashamed. Then she fell into a weary silence. When she finally spoke, she asked if Leonard mentioned whether he still had feelings for her. I told her that he did, but that he felt hopelessly trapped in old patterns. At that point, she buried her face in her hands and wept. My frustration toward her softened as I saw how deeply ingrained these beliefs were, likely passed down through generations. It dawned on me that she truly thought she was being a model wife, never realizing she was actually smothering her husband. Determined to see if there was a pathway toward healing, I suggested professional counseling. Janet recoiled at first, declaring therapy unnecessary. Wasn't love enough to fix any problem? But I countered that if she was so certain of her marital devotion, she should prove it by stepping outside her comfort zone. Eric backed me up, stressing that an unbiased perspective could help them learn healthier ways of relating. Eventually, Janet relented. She asked if I would speak to Leonard about the possibility, so I did. He was hesitant, but said he'd attend a session if Janet showed genuine commitment. True to her word, Janet scheduled an appointment with a couples therapist recommended by a friend. I accompanied them to the waiting room for moral support, feeling like an outsider in their marriage but oddly invested in its fate. As the door to the therapist's office closed behind them, I couldn't help recalling the day Janet introduced Amanda at my wedding, proclaiming she knew best. Now, she was acknowledging, albeit grudgingly, that she needed professional help to figure out what it meant to be a good partner. The twist was almost poetic in its irony, leaving me both hopeful and apprehensive about their outcome. After a few sessions, Janet and Leonard invited Eric and me to join them for a session so the therapist could grasp the family dynamics at play. Sitting in that softly lit room, I felt strangely vulnerable. We discussed Janet's tendency to micromanage, how she had undermined my wedding, and even how she had used Amanda as a prop. Janet listened, tearful yet receptive, when I described the humiliation and anger I'd experienced on my wedding day. She apologized, something I never imagined hearing from her. In turn, Leonard spoke about how her controlling ways extended beyond their marriage, affecting Eric's life decisions. Eric remained composed, explaining that while he loved his mother, he resented her habit of inserting her own ideals without regard for other people's feelings. It was an intense conversation, filled with raw confessions and uncomfortable truths. Yet, I sensed progress, an inching toward genuine self-awareness. When the session ended, Janet seemed exhausted but hopeful. She squeezed my hand, a silent gesture of gratitude, and I found myself returning it. Although I couldn't easily forget her past actions, I recognized that change was possible. Even Amanda, in all her unsavory behavior, was becoming a footnote in a broader story of transformation. In the weeks that followed, Janet and Leonard continued their therapy sessions. Eric and I helped where we could, making ourselves available for conversations that bridged the long-standing gaps in their communication. Gradually, Janet appeared to lessen her grip on absolute control. She began to ask people what they wanted instead of telling them what they needed. Leonard tentatively moved some of his belongings back, agreeing to a trial period of cohabitation under new terms. There were still tense moments. Arguments erupted over small things like grocery shopping and cleaning routines, but they no longer devolved into silent stalemates. They were learning to voice their frustrations and listen to each other, an alien concept to them before. One day, Janet even thanked me for opening her eyes to how her advice had caused harm. She admitted that her mother had taught her that a wife's identity existed solely in service to her husband. She now understood that a marriage was a partnership, not a dictatorship. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering resentment. While it was validating to see her evolve, I still carried the memory of her intrusion at my wedding. However, as I watched her earnestly attempt change, I let myself hope. A few months later, Eric and I hosted a gathering to celebrate both our belated wedding reception, the one we truly wanted, and the progress Janet and Leonard had made. Friends and family mingled in our backyard, enjoying barbecue and warm laughter. I spied Janet and Leonard chatting quietly by the gardenias, their hands intertwined. The sight made my heart lurch. I recalled the chaos of my original wedding day, the humiliation of Amanda's smug presence, and the sting of Janet's insistence that she knew how to build a perfect marriage. In a bizarre twist, her own near divorce had forced her to face the flaws in her approach. By relinquishing control and embracing vulnerability, she was finally learning what it meant to be a genuine partner. As the evening wound down, Janet approached me. She took my hands in hers and whispered, "I was wrong about you. Thank you for helping me save my marriage, and for showing me there's another way." Her eyes, though misty, shone with sincerity. I smiled, feeling a weight lift. Life had delivered all of us an unpredictable lesson. Sometimes the person you belittle turns out to be the one who offers the lifeline you never knew you needed.